So, welcome everybody, dear colleagues and friends, dear students. Today it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Dr. Sondra Hausner from Oxford University, who has come to Frankfurt for delivering this year's Jensen Memorial Lectures. Welcome, Sondra. Although I knew her anthropological writings on South Asia since long, I had never met her in person until she came to the University of Tübingen in 2014, where my wife, together with our colleague Vibayoshi, had organized a workshop on religion as resource. On this occasion, she guided a working group on religiosity and diaspora in Europe, and her contribution to the workshop impressed us so much that we invited her as a guest professor to Tübingen a year later. We kept in touch, and in 2017, I was very glad to receive the message that in light of her great achievements as a researcher and teacher, the St. Peter's College of the Oxford University had awarded her the Recognition of Distinction Award and conferred on her the title Professor of Anthropology of Religion. Professor Hausner's research focuses on lived religions worldwide, with a particular focus on ascetic traditions, ritual dynamics, pilgrimage, and diaspora. Her fieldwork experience includes several years of research in the Himalayas, as well as more recent ethnographic work in London on healing rituals at the site called Crossbones Graveyard. The academic output of this research is more than impressive. Her studies with South Asians form the basis for 2 monographs, 4 edited volumes, and a large number of articles in books and reviewed journals. Among the 2 monographs dealing with South Asia, her book on Wandering with Sadhus, Ascetics in the Hindu Himalayas, is, I think, outstanding. It is based on intensive fieldwork, or what Geertz called deep hanging out, in both India and Nepal, which extended over a period of 10 years, but in a way already began during her childhood. As she describes in her book, she and her sister grew up in Kathmandu. Her father was posted in this capital of Nepal as a United Nations official in 1975, and her mother, a trained yoga teacher, began improving her skills by attending yoga lessons of an ash-clad yogi, I quote, who could manipulate his body in the most astonishing positions. 20 years later, she returned to Pashupatinath, the place where she first met this yogi, in order to understand the world of the ascetics. The outcome of her research is a book that is based on excellent acquaintance with the lives of various ascetics, male and female, whose concepts of time, space, and the body she examines in minute detail. In her review of this work, Mary Cameron writes, I quote, "The first thing one notices about Sondra Hausner's sensitively written ethnography is its remarkable methodology. The second is its sustained focus on time, place, and embodiment as forming a coherent community and culture of renouncers, in contradistinction to the prevalent view of isolated, wandering, unattached individuals. The abundant descriptive, historical, and regional material Hausner presents in her book makes it highly recommended reading for students and scholars for South Asian religions and cultures, and her skill at respectfully bringing the reader into the lives of renouncers without an uncomfortable feeling of voyeurism is commendable. Quote, end of quote. To me, this book, published by Indiana University Press, belongs to the best 10 ethnographic accounts on South Asian religion, and it has become a kind of standard reference book for everybody working on renunciation in this region. In 2004, the American Institute of Indian Studies awarded it with the Joseph W. Elder Prize in Indian Social Sciences. Due to her continued field work, Professor Hausner has over the years become one of the leading anthropologists for the study of renunciation from a gender perspective, and it is therefore not surprising that she, along with two of the most important researchers on this subject, Meena Khandelwal and Anne Grotzing-Gold, is co-editor to the book Women's Renunciation in South Asia. With Meena Khandelwal, she wrote the introduction entitled Women on Their Own, in which the two authors describe the common life experiences of women in South Asia who renounce the world, leave behind their roles as wives and mothers in the search for the liberation of the soul. They argue that the real lives of these women look quite different from descriptions in the literary traditions which were mostly produced by men. Yet renunciation, despite all its hardships, also offers a way out of a desperate marriage or the stigma of not being married. Comparing the different case studies offered in this excellent book, the authors come to the conclusion that female renunciation in South Asia is not some kind of isolated endeavor, but a highly social act, as it not only requires the interaction with other renouncers, for example in a monastery, but also with members of the laity, may this be family or community members, or with us, the ethnographers. Professor Hausner is also known to me due to her original work on Emil Durkheim. Sorry, this was too fast. In 2013, she published this book entitled Durkheim in Disciplinary Dialogue, that I consider to be one of the best present re-evaluations of Durkheim's theoretical contributions. To this book, which she dedicated to her father, Bernhard Hausner, she contributed an introduction and a paper, both of which show her excellent acquaintance with Durkheim's writings and her amazing ability to involve present-day scholars in a dialogue about Durkheim's contributions. Published 101 years after Durkheim's classic Elementary Forms of Religious Life, Professor Hausner edited volume is a more than welcome contribution to a strand of thought that contains many inspirations for our students and can provide new insights into current phenomena. As she writes in her introduction, this book takes up Durkheim's central premise that religion is a social form in order to test it in a multiplicity of present-day contexts. She acknowledges Durkheim's work by writing, I quote, "Our findings, approaches, priorities, and objects of study have changed a great deal over the last 100 years. But the methods and theories that Durkheim set out in 1912 remain quite central, though often unacknowledged in our contemporary multidisciplinary investigations," end of quote. After Professor Hausner had joined the Oxford University, she also took up the task of giving new life to the so-called British Centre of Durkheimian Studies. The centre was established by the Durkheim scholar Bill Pickering in 1991 and has since then promoted research in various fields related to the work of Emil Durkheim. In 2017, I personally had the pleasure, thank you, of being invited to the inaugural workshop initiated by Professor Hausner, which carried the title, "Why Did Durkheim Have to Die?" The latest edition of the journal at this workshop of this center, the Durkheimian Studies, contains the papers presented at this workshop. In cooperation with Berghahn, the center publishes not only this journal, but also a number of monographs related to the work of Emile Durkheim, Marcel Mauss, Louis Dumont, and others. Professor Dr. Hausner herself shows how Durkheim can inspire contemporary anthropological work on religion with her most recent and very original book entitled The Spirits of Crossbones Graveyard, Time, Ritual and Sexual Commerce in London. In London's South Ark, is that pronounced? Southwark. I knew it will be pronounced different. In London's Southwark borough exists a graveyard called Crossbones, which is visited once a month by a group of people who at the gates of this graveyard want to honor the prostitutes who were buried in this place during medieval times. They were called Winchester Geese because the brothels that served the Londoners in this district of Southwark were taxed by the Bishop of Winchester. This group has a leader nowadays named John Constable alias John Crow. This is his totemic title, who is regarded by some as a shaman. He had received a vision in which he was given the instruction to elevate the status of Winchester Geese by performing rites and telling stories. He first composed a theater play performed at the local cathedral and later began the monthly performance at this graveyard. With the experienced eye of an ethnographer of religion, Professor Hausner detects in this urban setting religious phenomena not unlike those that she studied in far-off places. She captures the religious aspects of this urban setting, describes the events in the terms of myth, shamanism, and healing rituals. Yet at the same time, and in line what Evans Pritchard has taught us about anthropology and history, she also provides a historical contextualization of prostitution. Because at Crossbones Graveyard, people commemorate the souls of medieval prostitutes believed to be buried there. She convincingly argues, I think, that the rituals mobilize the past in order to shape the present. With this book, Dr. Hausner brings home anthropology. Her recent works on Nepali migrants may be interpreted in the same direction. In various articles, she refers to intensive studies on migrant rituals or border crossings, Nepali religious identities in Britain, or obstacles Nepali nurses have to overcome when they move to England for the sake of earning higher wages or getting professional training. Outside the university, she has shown great commitment in undertaking research in socially relevant areas. She has been active in promoting social development in India and Nepal, has done research for implementing projects on prostitution, trafficking, and migration, has designed and coordinated UN research on gender-based violence, and research on peace-building processes in Nepal. Professor Hausner nowadays belongs to the top anthropologists in the field of religion. And we are therefore very proud to have her here at the Frobenius-Institut in Frankfurt for a whole month. Today, and in the following 4 weeks, she will deliver the Adolf Ellegard Jensen Memorial Lectures 2019. The title of her lecture is A Genealogy of Method, Anthropology's Ancestors and the Meaning of Culture. And as this title already suggests, she will ask the question what we can learn from our anthropological ancestors for our contemporary endeavors as anthropologists, students, and lecturers alike. I'm very much looking forward to listening to your 4 lectures, and I welcome you again in the name of the Frobenius-Institut and the Goethe University of Frankfurt. Thank you. Now it's your turn. This falls down all the time.
Thank you so much. It's been incredible.
Sorry, I need to change this. Wait.
Aha.
Now, here you go.
Great. Well, that was an extraordinary introduction. Thank you so much, and thank you for your welcome. I think I will lower this. Is that all right? Good. Okay. I didn't expect that, and I'm now bowled over before having to give a first lecture. But perhaps it's fitting because, as it turns out, Adolf Jensen was an anthropologist of religion. So I feel like my topic is exactly right, because we can pay homage to our ancestors in this field. Just do this. Okay. All right. I'll take a pen also. So thank you so much again for the invitation to be this year's Jensen lecturer. It is really a great honor to be here at the Goethe University and the Frobenius-Institut. Can you hear me when I turn my head? Is it okay? Yeah? And it's really a pleasure to be here with old friends and new, I hope, and here in Frankfurt. I've only just arrived, but I really do look forward to being here over the course of the month and to having conversations with many of you about South Asia, gender, asceticism, topics that I won't necessarily be covering in today's or this lecture series, but there will be other opportunities. And thank you in particular to Roland for the invitation, not to mention the introduction. It's wonderful to have a continuation of these conversations. I'm especially pleased to give a set of lectures named for Adolf Jensen. And in these distinguished named lecture series, it's customary, as you may know, to spend a few moments on the accomplishments and legacy of the person for whom the series is named. And usually the lecturer mentions a work or two and a few points about their research, and then moves on to the topic at hand after some niceties and an appropriate homage to a figure of old. But I hope you will excuse me, and I hope I will not be repeating known territory if I spend a little more time with Jensen than lecturers normally do. I've spent some time getting to know his work over the past few months, and I must admit that I've become quite charmed by him. His work is really quite pertinent to the material at hand today, the genealogy of method, and particularly the meaning of culture. So, unfortunately, and this is my loss, I don't read German, and the single text of Jensen that has been translated into English is, and I feel embarrassed that I'm using the English version, but I hope you will forgive me, Myth and Cult Among Primitive Peoples. And what the flap says is that Jensen is, quote, able to demonstrate the importance of anthropology for the study of comparative religion. And I think he still does, after more than 70 years. The text was published in German in 1951 and translated into English in 1963. Jensen takes up the mid-20th century question of religion and shows how we as anthropologists can contribute to studying it. Significantly, he both asks what qualities religion has, that is, going beneath the surface, what qualities of humanity religion displays, and what form or forms religion takes over time. And beautifully, he insists that because of our roles as ethnographers, people who spend considerable time in the field, anthropological methods are uniquely suited to accessing a broader range of cultures and religions than scholars had access to previously, and that we are therefore in a unique position to consider the, quote, nature of culture. It's a wonderful phrase, it's his, I use it often, the nature of culture, which is, of course, the nature of being human. And I could not agree more, although I come from a very different anthropological tradition, an Anglophone one, trained in the US, now in British circumstances, etc., and I work more than half a century later. But still, he's got it right. This is the anthropology of religion in a nutshell. So I've been completely won over by Jensen, and also therefore somewhat mystified as to why his name has fallen out of common parlance in anthropological circles, at least in Anglophone ones, and I suspect in French ones. Perhaps you know his work better than the Anglophone schools and the French schools do. Who knows Jensen's work in this room? Okay, so even in Germany, his name has fallen out of popularity, shall we say, and perhaps I can give him a little bit of contemporary credibility. I'm surprised by this, in truth, because he seems so forward-thinking, a man ahead of his time, whose clear skill both as an ethnographer and as a theorist of the human condition should have confirmed his place and his legacy as a known figure in our discipline. But he is absent from the most beloved and most widely used works in the anthropology of religion, the Lesse and Vogt Reader in Comparative Religion, Brian Morris's Anthropological Studies of Religion, Michael Lambeck's A Reader in the Anthropology of Religion. Where did Jensen go? Why did he fall from grace? Now, in those sources where he is mentioned, he commands great respect. He appears 13 times in the Encyclopedia of Religion, and more impressively, Jacques Hardenberg's substantial 2-volume work on classical approaches to the study of religion notes that mid-century anthropologists who focused exclusively on the, quote, religious aspects of cultures and civilizations were a minority, unquote, but that a few made significant contributions. Hardenberg writes, quote, 2 prominent names should be mentioned, Alfred Kroeber, 1876 to 1960, who did much work on North American Indians and may be considered as one of the most universally minded anthropologists. And in Germany, there was the outstanding work of Adolf E. Jensen, 1899 to 1965, a specialist on Indonesian primitive religion who gave much attention to the theory of culture and the methodology of the disciplines studying it, unquote. Kroeber would rise to global fame, Jensen not so, although he was surely as universally minded as Kroeber, if a close reading of his texts would guide us. In any event, I like to think that the topic of these lectures in Jensen's honor would have pleased him. I precisely have taken up the mantle to study the theory of culture and the methodology of the discipline studying it, to repeat Hardenberg's formulation. In the spirit of tracing our lineage and mapping our genealogy as a discipline, which is what I want these lectures to do, I wonder if Professor Jensen's own trajectory can give us some clues as to why he was so well known in specialist circles, and also as to why he, along with the cultural morphology school of which he was a part, fell out of favor or consciousness in Anglophone and Francophone anthropology. Jensen himself speaks to one reason why those of us trained in the United States do not know him as well as we should, in his preface to Myth and Cult Among Primitive Peoples. Quote, regrettably, he writes, there has been little contact or collaboration between the anthropologists of the United States and Germany. German anthropology has met with little sympathetic understanding in America. This may be the result of the philosophical orientation of German anthropological thought, but a certain part of the suspicion is a holdover from the days when the so-called Kulturkreiselehre, is it correct? Held sway, unquote. And so we begin. The cultural diffusionist school, the cultural circles school, the cultural morphology school. What does it mean to study culture? And what does culture finally mean? The history of our discipline, both what was more commonly known or thought of as ethnology in the time of Jensen, and what is now more widely referred to as social, or better for our purposes, cultural anthropology, shows that there is not a constant answer to this question, or even a constant object of study, let alone a consistent approach to uncovering it, or doing so. Ethnography, ethnology, anthropology, Völkerkunde have engaged in a range of methods and a continuously rotating intention in a history of attempts to understand humanity in all its variation. On one hand, we inhabit the most noble and directly questioning discipline. What does it mean to be human? And on the other, we are faced with the most challenging and even opaque problematic. How does human culture vary? How can we search for a unifying answer to what makes us human, even as we precisely observe how immensely differentiated we are? And critically, how can we explain that such difference is the very core of what makes us similarly human? This is a paradox at its very essence, no less so as we try to establish a scientific or a humanistic method through which we intend to pursue our disciplinary questions. We are asking, so to speak, the key question of the human sciences, the most closely integrated to the very nature of humanity. What is culture? Now, you try and find a PowerPoint slide to illustrate that question. This is not my answer to what is culture. Maybe by the end of 4 lectures, I'll have a slide that tells you. This is from an article entitled "A Formal Definition of Culture," and it's by linguists or organizational behaviorists. Everyone, actually, in truth, in their heart, wants to be an anthropologist. But so this is one attempt to classify what is culture. But our question is, how can culture be a source of sameness and difference at the same time? Let us try and break down our inquiry, our genealogy, into recognizable parts in order to patiently and carefully understand the constituent elements of culture and our method of approaching it. I think I prefer T.S. Eliot's to the linguistic one. This is not a formal definition either, but we may as well use great authors as well as semantic definitions. Over the course of these 4 lectures, I want to ask, what does it mean when anthropologists say we study culture? Where is the location of culture? Where do we find it? Is it in language, action, practice, objects, or the very air we breathe? And how, if the object of study is so elusive, do we access it in the first place? Thus is our field so varied, expansive, and inclusive. But also thus is our field so, at times, acrimonious, divided, and splintered, even about what it is we study, let alone how we do so, or what we may find when we get there. My hope is that this series will enable us to look at the cumulative history of the anthropological endeavor in its attempt to understand culture in all its human variations, through a focus on how we access such a vast and ephemeral question and set of circumstances. We know culture exists, and we know it is there. We know it is fundamental to who we are and to how we relate to one another. But how do we see it? How do we know it when we find it, especially if it is changing all the time? Perhaps we can think of this lecture series as a cultural history of studying culture. Locating the mutual production of sameness and variation sounds an impossible task. If culture is always with us, it is not always the same, even within an individual, let alone a collective, however culturally bounded it may be. So how on earth are we able to place it, fix it, define it? Anthropology's strength lies in its history of attempts to understand how sameness and difference across human societies can be understood in a single frame. Whether we compare cultures or delve deeply into the dynamics of a single social order, or both at the same time, as Adolf Jensen did, anthropology's task is to confront the interplay between the nature of humanity, quote, the essence, unquote, as Jensen would have called it, and its cultural manifestation. And we cannot do so in a simplistic way, by definition. As Jensen knew, and even as Frobenius knew before him, culture emerges from the inside out. It is not something that tops us up, or it sort of comes in at the top of the test tube as biological beings. Culture is our essence, as paradoxical as that may sound. And in this seemingly simple construction, the complexity of our discipline lies. Whether we compare cultures across region or history, or describe particular societies in specific times and places, our discipline's task is to parse or distinguish between the universal human condition and the particular cultural form. Considering religion, ritual, history, and the nature of time, then, I want to try to piece together how we have come to understand culture in all its human variation and see if we are on the right track, and perhaps offer some correctives if we need to be slightly modified in our trajectory. To be human is to be part of something both universal, culturally speaking, and necessarily particular. It is to take part in the human condition as constructed by the cultural form. Our sameness and our variation not only coexist, but they are mutually interdependent elements of humanity's social worlds. So let us trace the ancestry of the contemporary anthropology that can ask this question and bring our own family tree, our disciplinary kinship diagram, out into the open. Where do our lineages come from? How did our methods arise? Whence our focus on meaning? What is the cultural evolution of our study of cultural evolution? If we could sit down and talk with our forebears, what would we ask them? What would we tell them? And how would they answer? Our histories have much to teach us, but like any good pupil or descendant, we too have something new to offer back to them, from forward in time, down the tree of the generations. Okay, so the middle section of the paper is called The Question of Culture in the Form of Religion. Professor Jensen gives us a wonderful starting point from which to see how anthropology is focused on discovering the nature of humanity. The way Jensen went about it, impressively, was to study in great and painstaking detail a multiplicity of cultures in order to understand from the ground up, or from the slide down, I've put them in the other order, from the ground up, how the world seems to be for someone from an Ethiopian point of view, that is on the bottom of the slide, an Eastern Indonesian or Malaccan islander, to be specific, point of view, that's on the top of the slide, also from a Libyan point of view or from a German point of view in the 1930s or 40s or 50s. And I'm speaking, of course, in broad geographical terms. One would narrow it down by area, ethnicity, locality, accordingly. I wanted to find a slide of the world, but the distance was too far from Ethiopia to Indonesia to show it in a single screen, so you'll have to make do with a slide. I think it's slightly fuzzy, apologies for that, but Google was unable to find public transport, let's put it that way. Jensen's ethnology does not stop there. From this data, crucially, there is a second analytical step, which is a comparison, implicit or explicit, between these multiple points of view. Not to see whether there is a universal viewpoint exactly. Most anthropologists, even in mid-century, and certainly now, agree that there isn't a universal viewpoint, that is, but to see if there is a parallel way of inhabiting the cultures that at the same time inform who we are. Do human cultures operate in the same way, or at least analogous or cognate ways, despite their enormous variation, which we must also take at face value, given the detailed comparative knowledge that our discipline possesses? This balancing act, which is what it is, between allowing for difference and seeking the commonality within human societies, is a delicate and subtle endeavor, and it is the crux of what anthropology has done for more than 100 years. This is a photograph taken from the 1950 expedition of Jensen and his students, and I think then on to the Frobenius-Institut, to southern Ethiopia, his return visit from an earlier one in 1934. And it's a picture of a Bunama elder woman, and it's a photograph I find particularly moving. Why did A.E. Jensen consider the heart of culture to be religion? A position with which we can still broadly agree. And why do I begin this first of a lecture series about the meaning of culture with the question of religion? What is it about religion that seems to reveal the heart of variable cultural life? Jensen was not the first to suggest such a relation, nor the last, but as an ethnologist primarily interested in the contours of specific cultural life, it is telling that myth and ritual constitute the heart of his analysis. We have many interpretations for what myth and ritual, each in their turn, mean, culturally speaking. But what Jensen knew, intuitively, and also ethnographically, from the record and from the data, is that religion and its constituent parts reflect the essence, constructed though it may be, of culture. Myth and ritual, and we could add symbol, tell both the participant and the observer what to pay attention to. They inflect systems of morality and, of course, systems of meaning. They teach, they endure, and yet they are not static, or at least not initially. They are the building blocks, the working units, the very stuff, materially, cognitively, affectively, as Jensen would have it, not only of religion, but also the whole of culture. He was ahead of his time, convinced that bodily responses to religious cultural forms and cultural responses to our bodily forms were the locus of the definition of culture and also of cultural difference. And in fact, this theoretical move anticipates the contemporary anthropological focus on affect. He's 70 years ahead. In applying Frobenius' focus on experience to human beings' conceptions of the cosmos, Jensen knew that our most intimate psychic worlds constructed what Max Weber before him and Clifford Geertz after him would simply call our worldviews. These are photographs from the Wimali people in Seram Island, which is the other area where Jensen did a lot of field work, on the far east of Indonesia, in the South Pacific, if I'm not mistaken. Professor Jensen is clear that religion is one, perhaps the highest or the clearest, but certainly not the only manifestation of culture. His interpretation of the cultural life cycle, from what he calls, quote, a state of expression to, quote, one of application, as he says, quote, applies, of course, to myths and narratives as it applies to all other cultural manifestations, unquote. This creative capacity to generate a form of communication that enabled the transmission and longevity of a particular culture is in an effervescent form reminiscent of Durkheim. And Jensen argues that it pertains to, quote, all forms of art, music, painting, sculpture, and it applies with possibly even greater force to all forms of religious expression. Taking the form of cultic action, it proved more effective even than language in transmitting certain cognitive insights, unquote. So what he's arguing is that religion is the place where we can see this human capacity for creativity, that humans are irrepressibly creative, that we can't help it, that's who we are, is to be expressive, and that expression comes out of our innate, natural creativity. Religion, he argues, is the foremost location, the foremost form of that creativity, of that expressiveness, and we can identify it most readily in ritual. This is the power, the use value, the analytical potential of religion. In short, for Jensen, religion is a way in, the way in, to the study of culture. To consider the question of religion as an aspect, the central aspect of culture, is to have an access point through which to understand the nature of humanity. He was convinced, correctly in my view, that an analysis of religion, primitive or modern, animist, totemist, or naturist, in creative form, or in adaptive form, or in ceremonial form, or even for those of you sitting here thinking religion isn't relevant anymore, even in secular form, come to that this was our core tenet, the core tenet of human society, the core tenet of human culture, or the basis of any understanding of human society or human culture. He had that breadth of view through which he could see the multiple ways, the infinite number of ways that people engaged their religious worlds. And if religion doesn't compute for you, if you're wondering what that means, you can substitute culture. You can say, people engaged in their cultural worlds. It has the same meaning for Jensen and for others in the anthropology of religion. We can take up in discussion whether institutional religion has to be classified differently, but what these early scholars of religion, Jensen among them, are talking about is that religion is, in some sense, the form that culture takes. So don't be put off by the use of the word religion, even if you're an atheist, even if you think religion is on its way out. Understand religion in terms of religious culture or even culture writ large. Importantly, Jensen breaks from the seemingly perennial obsession of his predecessors on the origin and function on religion, and he avoids the pitfalls of his successors, who want to look at the form or structure, if not always the function, of religion, and who mistakenly, in his view, I think, would fix particular manifestations of ritual in cultural time and place without allowing them to breathe. So these are three texts in the study of religion, in the anthropology of religion. They span more than 100 years. Fraser was first published in 1890, talking specifically about the origin and primitive peoples. Malinowski's text is published in the 1920s, focused specifically on the function of religion, that it had to be in the service of something else. And Humphrey and Laidlaw is published in 1994, talking about form rather than origin or content or structure. 100 years later, and scholars are still trying to reckon with religion in all of its manifestation. And the reason that I have decided to give today's lecture over to Jensen is because he somehow avoids all of this. He's not interested. He's interested, but it's not his central preoccupation in origin. He's interested, but it's not his central preoccupation function. He's interested, but it's not his central preoccupation form. He makes a right turn and says all of this is in some sense missing the point of what it was within our purview of knowledge. Religion is the expression of human creativity, the result of the human capacity to integrate our inner experience with our views of the outer world. Beautiful, extraordinary. Let's teach him again. He writes, quote, "I am convinced of man's undiminished creative capacities. Throughout history, new aspects of reality have revealed themselves to man, humans, spurring the innate creativity of his nature, humans' nature, to express new insights through new cultural formulations." This is a unique and powerful argument in 2019, and I don't think we've seen it in anthropology since. Humans are innately creative, imaginative, and religion is the forum, the preeminent representational world for our perennially new forms of thinking. We will not run out of thoughts. We will not run out of experiences. We will not run out of culture. And this is why religion will not end. So Jensen argues that the confusing thing for researchers of so-called early religion, at least the first two texts on this slide, is that religion is also, in turn, the repository, and maybe this is what some of us secularists also have a problem with, perhaps, I don't know. We can debate the nuances of Jensen's theories at another point. He argues that religion is also, in turn, the location or domain, the repository, as I said, of our species' tendencies to form habits and to create traditions. And such traditions invariably, unwittingly, through force of time and repetition, and through humans' natural inclination to become habit-forming, drain some of that creativity away. We, quote, decline from, unquote, a moment of expression to one of application or even petrifaction. We get stuck, in other words. And this is where functionality comes in. Religious actions come to be seen, both on the part of actors participating in the religious acts and on the part of ethnographers who are listening to actors participating in the religious acts, as instrumental or functional. And we believe them. We take them at face value. They say we do this so the rain will fall. We write down they do this because the rain will fall. But Jensen argues this is a misattribution. By the time it is practiced habitually, a religious formulation seems to need a reason for existing at all, rather than stand for the inherent expressiveness of humanity, which is what it is. So Jensen is interested in the origins of religion, to be sure. It was impossible not to be in mid-century European intellectual culture, for it stands in for the search for the origins of humanity. I'm not going to read this slide. In Anglophone cultures, we don't read out the PowerPoint. We let you read it while I talk, and you keep two narratives in your head simultaneously. But this is, and I'm also not going to read it because it seems unjust to read Jensen in English to you when you can read it in German in the original. So this is while you're hearing an English lecture, and then you can read it on your own in German. But Jensen knows that the more fruitful search is in the manifestation of religious forms. He is speaking in particular to Sir Edward Tyler, whose major work, Primitive Culture, sets the stage for an analysis of religious origins through an exploration of so-called early man. Tyler is complimented by Jensen as a fine, quote, ethnologist. Okay, I'll give you a picture of the contemporary picture of primitive culture, the Himalayas, my home, fine. This is published in 1871, not this particular edition, but the book is published, Primitive Culture is first published in 1871, so is really much taught, much debated by the time Jensen is writing 70 years later, 70 years after Tyler. Tyler is complimented by Jensen as a fine ethnologist and someone committed to his science, but also of badly misinterpreting his data. Tyler and others in his wake had argued that the origin of religion, as seen in primitive culture, was a primitive misapprehension of reality. Tyler argues that primitives just don't understand. They're in a kind of dreamlike state. They don't have the evolved mentality that modern cultures do, so they can't tell the difference between what's a spirit and what's a human. And this angers Jensen and many other scholars subsequently. For Jensen, Tyler and those following him had simply mistaken a rote application of ritual, the time when a religious act was no longer vibrant or active, for the equivalent of a more meaningful or creative phase of what Tyler suggested were more evolved religions. But Jensen argues that things were further along in primitive culture than Tyler and his followers assumed. So what was seen as and interpreted as the origin of religion was in fact the deadening of it, a fate which applies just as surely to our own cultures as well. Quote, Jensen writes, "At all times, these formulations, by which he means religious or cultural formulations, have had to submit to the law of degeneration," unquote. Oh, sorry. I think I'm missing a slide. Okay, sorry. Primitive culture, which to Tyler and his followers meant primitive mentality, is no more degenerate than our own. Again, significantly, forcefully, Jensen unilaterally insists that primitives and moderns are at the same level of culture, blowing out of the water any suggestions that primitive mentalities are lesser than modern or European ones. Quote, "I assume that man in primal times is essentially what he is today," unquote. And he writes evocatively, presciently, that what looks like barbarity or, quote, primal stupidity is not confined to one phase of human evolution. It has its representatives at all stages of culture. I'll leave you to deduce where else we might find instances of primal stupidity. Jensen's understanding of religion and culture thus transcends a polarity between dynamism and stasis, or between synchrony and diachrony, by showing us how religion is about both generativity and performativity. This is an astonishing insight and one that is undeniably modern in its outlook, to remind us that humans are creative and that religion is the place where the instinct for imagination or inventiveness takes off, consolidates everything we know about culture. Human beings are not limited by their biology and are capable of, indeed compelled to, express themselves in much bigger ways than their individual bodies would require. And these modes of expression have precisely no constraints at all. Culture is about being unconstrained, not boxed in, not coded in. Religion, by which I mean culture, is the source of humanity. Now, the reason I suspect Jensen isn't taught anymore, and the reason his school, the Cultural Morphology School, fell down, it seems to me, is with the boundedness of the model. So when you Google cultural morphology today, as I did, you are presented with a series of images of biology laboratories. That's what this is, okay? So these are petri dishes. And the biologists now do something called cultural morphology. So when you try and find out what cultural morphology is, this is where you are led. Like many anthropologists before them, Frobenius and Jensen wanted their science of humankind to be properly scientific. But culture, to an anthropologist, cannot be contained in a petri dish. So this is what the biologists have to say about cultural morphology. Culture, in cultural terms, it ebbs and flows, its boundaries breathe. Jensen's weakness is that his own model, although not static, is too fixed. In wanting to ensure a universalizing vision that applies equally to primitive religions and modern ones, thus leveling the playing field between primitive cultures and modern ones, he argues for a singular and unifying set of steps for all human cultural rituals. They emerge in an expression of fluorescent creativity in their early stages, and then they become rote, victims of institutional habit-making and historical patterns. This is Jensen in Ethiopia, I presume in 1934, correct? Yeah, I think so. I presume it's the early expedition, this one. Yeah. This is 1950 also? You think it's 1950? Anyway, it's a nice picture. And you get the feeling that he loved where he was, which is what comes across, I think, in his analytical work as well. Jensen knew the importance of time in cultural change, and he emphasized that change was an element of culture. He understood that culture must be understood as a dynamic, living entity, not a static, fixed one. And his motive for arguing that all religious cultures follow the same pattern is well-meaning. He does not want to distinguish between different types of cultures or different levels of evolvedness or evolution. But insisting upon one pattern alone, he flattens the playing field of possibilities. Maybe some cultures experience creative surges and bursts. Maybe some traditions start out constrained or are forced or impelled by a political movement and become more expressive, not less, as time goes on. Or some individuals might weave in elements of creative interpretation or personal touches in the face of local exigencies or realities. In a way, Jensen falls prey to his own predictions, wanting the world to fit a pattern, rather than letting it take an open-ended and indeterminate form, and allowing for the possibility of an infinite set of cultural manifestations that will always resist tabulation or confinement, which is what is essential to our humanity. But even here, Jensen is onto something, for I would suggest it is in the very form of ritual that we come to terms with that which is enduring, static, ongoing, that is the particular morphology or form of a given or specific ethnological whole, and that which is evolving. So on one hand, that which is enduring and static, on the other hand, that which is evolving, changing, accommodating, acknowledging, the particular occasion of a known form of practice. In short, ritual is the site of both continuity and change, recognized pattern and inventive newness, morphology and cultural shift. Jensen's intuitions were correct. By arguing for the seriousness of primitive religion and refusing to relegate it to a second class or second order or lesser status, he engages in an intellectual commitment that mirrors his political views, which refuse to sign on to the state's ranking of different kinds of human groups, races, cultures, or religions. He knew that when we see other cultural groups not as culturally different, but as ontologically distinct, a danger emerges that is difficult to overstate. Okay, that's the end of the second section. I know it was a long one. Thank you for your patience. Okay, the last section is called the method of comparison. In Jensen's day, cultures were understood to be clearly delineated, almost hermetically sealed in territory, and the anthropologist's task was to unlock the code that could reveal the form of that particular place. We insisted upon a one-to-one equation of location to society. One location got one society, got one culture, got one religion, and we could line them up in a row, embodied by their combs, possibly. We insisted upon a one-to-one equation of location to society in our understanding of culture. It was all so clean, so discreetly bounded. We could compare human groups and thus come to understand humanity by assuming that each was like a control group for each other. As we've been discussing, whether so-called primitive cultures represented an early form of modern society, coeval, by which I mean at the same time, though they were, was one of the great evolutionary debates of the early 20th century, and we can see from his writings that Jensen was still fighting the battle in the mid-20th century. Whether or not they were considered lesser beings than those in more evolved societies, however, whichever side of this debate you fell on, whether you were Tyler or Jensen or Durkheim, primitives were methodologically useful. They seemed to stick to themselves in discrete, recognizable, small-scale tribes or tribal units, which meant they could be measured and compared with each other and with moderns. And it was the anthropologists who had exclusive access to the primitives, for the comparative study of religious cultures had, until fieldwork became the accepted method of anthropological studies of culture, been limited to textual study of historical cultures, mostly in the domain of philology, and philologists who were studying sacred texts. The study of living cultures meant anthropologists had exclusive rights, as it were, to non-literate societies, or so-called simpler societies. Such cultures were not only ostensibly easier to study, but they were also extant or existing cultures with living people in them. Living primitives both confirmed anthropology's use value and, at the same time, especially in the German context, opened up the world, actually in all contexts, but in a particular way in the German context, opened up the world of cross-cultural comparison to new heights from a science of religion that was heavily dominated by textual analysis, and that was at its height in Germany, throughout the 19th century. Interestingly, for a discipline that takes cross-cultural perspectives as the heart of its analysis, anthropology has produced relatively little on the nature of comparison itself, much less, say, than on ethnography or on method in general, although the comparative question is always hovering in the background, especially if you're looking at the question methodologically. For explicit interrogations of comparison, we must look rather to our sister discipline in the humanities, comparative literature, where our colleagues have taken up the question of comparison rather more explicitly and rather more critically. To understand the history of an anthropology of comparative religion, then, we need to interrogate the assumptions of comparison as a method, or the baseline project of comparing culture. Here, Tomoko Masuzawa's excellent scholarship illuminates how, from the 18th century, comparative philology was at the heart of the project to create the, quote, the logic of scientific comparativism, unquote. Philology was an excellent starting point for the project of cultural and then religious comparison. If language is an equivalent structure for all human societies, by deciphering languages, and in due course you can see that we're going to go to religion. If religion is an equivalent structure, then by deciphering religion. But when we're dealing with languages, we start earlier in the 18th, and then 19th, and then 20th century. Philologists could claim to establish the relations and histories between seemingly disparate cultures, and specifically the sacred texts of those cultures, and perhaps discover the origins of their own. Naturally, the comparative endeavor also emerges from the analysis of species and their histories and relations that swept the sciences in the face of Darwin and Spencer's work in the mid-19th century. Biology could be scientifically wrought, and language groups were no different. From there, then as now, the link between language and culture, and more specifically, the link between scriptural language and sacred text, meant that comparative philology held the key to understanding what would come to be known as world religions. And this is what Masuzawa is arguing, through the texts and the languages that made them their own. The philological endeavor also revealed potential links between language families. Some of these reputed family trees, such as that between Indic civilization and German Aryanism, for example, were to have devastating political consequences by the mid-20th century. These dark histories need not be recounted in detail here, but we do well to recall that the groundwork for comparative religion was not always a neutral affair. What we need to recall, too, is that comparative philology was intimately linked with comparative religion in the histories of these disciplines, leading to the damaging twin legacies of a hierarchical evolutionist taxonomy of human races and cultures and religions on one hand, and the exclusive use of textual materials to understand religions, such that a spiritual canon comprised of so-called sacred texts became the default designation and the implicit criterion of being a world religion on the other. Anthropology has very effectively challenged both of these legacies, as Jensen, among others, has taught us. We no longer have any truck with human evolutionism, and we know that lived religion can be the most meaningful way to experience religion in practice. This is another reason understanding religion as synonymous with culture was productive during this early period or formative stage of the anthropology of religion. Religion is a good thing to compare. It is also another reason it was so important to refuse to rank the values or mentality of primitive cultures in relation or comparison to modern ones. Like language or kinship, religion is something everybody seemed to have. Whether emphasizing universalist or hierarchical qualities, whether using primitive or modern religions, literate or non-literate societies, or textual or non-textual sources as sources of data, religion appears as a human universal that, like culture, takes on multiple and seemingly incomparable or incommensurable forms. The anthropologist's task is not to establish which worldview is closer to the truth, but to explain how it is that humanity has arrived at so many seemingly incompatible conclusions at the same time. There is an inherent distinction between comparative studies that seek sameness and those that seek difference. And it is not as simple as saying that seeking sameness is the path to understanding. The German theological tradition that also claims the name anthropology, coming from an entirely different disciplinary vantage point, searches for universal truths about mankind, as does the famous historian of religion Mircea Eliade, who actually created the field of the history of comparative religions. Our discipline, cultural anthropology, is more at home with the possibility, and this I'm arguing is a good thing, of deep, sustained, incommensurable differences that occur through and that define culture. Anthropology, to its credit, in more recent decades, but also, as we have seen, to its shame in the early phases of the field, has always looked for difference. In the contemporary field, in our contemporary discipline at least, cultural anthropologists know that difference must be honored, even at the level of small-scale societies. The attribution of difference has gone from being a 19th century weapon against another culture to a 21st century source of celebration of all cultures. This is a complex history. We could call it a history of difference, perhaps, and I hope I have not confused you, because there's a lot of different terms that come about as we study the history of studying culture and its relation to the history of studying religion. My point is simply that the anthropological ambivalence around the method of comparison is one of the great confusions and impasses of our field. On one hand, we have the great comparative legacy of Weberian sociology, which all of these schools have embraced with open arms. Weber recuperates the possibility of comparison in the early 20th century with the methodological innovation of the ideal type and the benefit of the discipline of history. If there is a danger to comparison, there is also a potency and an intellectual power. But on the other hand, a move away from comparative social analysis and to refuse to compare apples and oranges, as the old saying goes, or let's say the Trobrianders and the Azande in the anthropological equivalent, that too has informed our current disciplinary practice. As Weber knew, to understand difference while insisting on equivalence creates a different problem for social or cultural anthropology. Not all translations work, and not all elements of one culture can be found in another. Indeed, this is the point of culture. The critique of cultural relativism lies in the misplaced insistence that something must always have an equal or equivalent form or meaning in another context or culture, and this is clearly false. An ethnographer must enter into the conceptual representational world of the society he or she wishes to study and represent it in turn. There simply may be no equivalent. In American cultural anthropology, Clifford Geertz would claim the mantle of culture as a matter of translation or interpretation. Despite his Weberian roots, he resisted the idea of comparison. Indeed, a good ethnologist, this is definitely from 1950, if I'm not mistaken, and this is Haberland and Jensen in Ethiopia. Indeed, a good ethnologist, or two in this case, cannot work on the basis of an ideal type. In a living society, human details, emotions, experiences, perspectives are all. They may be representative of the human condition, but they cannot be collapsed to an ideal type if the meaning of a particular culture, or from there, the meaning of the human phenomenon of culture, is to emerge. So, in a nutshell, the anthropological question is, or has become, how do we allow difference to shine through the threat of homogenization as we try to explain the nature of humanity? The question becomes not how do we ensure we see the forest through the trees, but how do we ensure that the trees through which we seek the forest are seen in their own terms, their own soil conditions, the light and the water that they need, their particular latitudes and longitudes, the amount of oxygen they produce, such that we see the groves that together make up the forests of the earth. Whether it be a search for sameness in a crude Eliadian fashion, or a search for difference, let me start again. Whether it be a search for sameness in a crude Eliadian fashion, difference in a hierarchical mode, as Tyler and Fraser insisted upon, difference in a more noble methodological sense in the way of Weber, or in the most sophisticated anthropological rendering like Jensen, or Durkheim before him, or Geertz after him, sameness through difference, or even equally transitively, difference through sameness. Religion, to use Levi-Strauss's phrase, is good to think with. For Adolf Jensen, it would mean that our experiences of the world would inform our cosmology, and our view of the heavens would infuse our experiences of the world. More importantly, wherever we were from and whichever era we lived in, our creativity as a human species would give rise to a ritual before, over time, it became a tradition. We still live in these rituals, these traditions, these manifestations of culture, world over. And Jensen is in the back here in 1950 in his group expedition to Ethiopia. Jensen wanted both to know cultural worlds in detail and use that knowledge to speak to the reality of humanity. He used multiple individual cultures, as indicators of the broader human relationship to culture. This is the mode of his comparison. By placing side by side variable cultural manifestations as a way to understand the human condition writ large, Jensen avoids the trap of creating false equivalents. Instead, he finds patterns that apply across the board, and thus presumably universally, while ensuring that each culture he analyzes remains intact, understood, interpreted in its own right, so that it may be seen as in an integrated whole fashion, revealing its creative spirit and the human ceremonial repetitiveness that derives from it alike. These are the patterns that we all share. And thus may we understand culture in the singular through the depth of our knowledge of cultures in the plural, in a way that does honor both to the forest that is human social life and to the individual trees that indicate that forest, and without which there would be no greenery or oxygen whatsoever. Thank you.